hope you've had a great week. Today we're going to be going over some example questions for exam 4 from chapters 12 and 14. Our first question asks for the critical value for F when our alpha level is set at 0.05 in a study with 4 treatments and n equals 10 participants in each treatment. First, we'll determine how many participants are in the entire study by taking the value for the number of treatments and multiplying it by the number of participants in each treatment. We come to a number of 40. For our degrees of freedom within, we'll take the number of participants in the entire study and subtract the number of treatments. We come up with 36. Our degrees of freedom between are the number of treatments minus 1, and in this case are 3. In order to find our critical value, our numerator will be our degrees of freedom between, and the denominator will be the degrees of freedom within. The picture on the right shows what it would look like in the homework, but in the exam we don't have access to that graphic, so you'll have to look up your answer in table B4 of the appendix in your text. Our next question asks for n, or the number of participants in each treatment, if the DF total is 43 and the study has 4 treatments. Since we know that the DF total is equal to the number of participants in the entire study minus 1, we can add 1 to each side to determine the value for capital N. We also know that the number of participants in the entire study is equal to the number of participants in each treatment multiplied by the number of treatments. So, we can plug our known values into this equation and we'll come up with 44 equals 4 times n. We can divide each side by 4, which gives us a value of 11 for the number of participants in each treatment. Our next question asks us how many treatments are being compared when an ANOVA produces an SS between of 60 and an MS between of 20. After looking at our mean square formula, we can manipulate it by multiplying each side by degrees of freedom and then dividing each side by the mean square, which will allow us to use this formula to solve for degrees of freedom. Then we can use our degrees of freedom formula to determine how many treatment conditions are being compared. We'll plug our degrees of freedom in, add 1 to each side, and we come up with 4 treatment conditions. Our next question gives us a partially filled out ANOVA table and tells us that we have 5 treatment conditions and how many participants in each treatment. We're given the values for SS between and SS total, and we need to find the missing value for the F ratio. We'll start with our sum of squares formula. Because we have the SS between and total, we can easily find the within by solving for SSW. To find our degrees of freedom, we first have to determine how many participants are in the entire study. We're given the number of treatment conditions and the amount of participants in each treatment conditions. We'll multiply these two numbers to find how many participants are in the entire study. Then we'll use that number and subtract 1 to find the total degrees of freedom, which will be 24. The degrees of freedom between are equal to the total number of treatments minus 1 and are equal to 4. The degrees of freedom within is the sum of degrees of freedom in each treatment, but can also be found by taking the degrees of freedom total and subtracting the degrees of freedom between. In this case, will be 20. Now that we have sum of squares and degrees of freedom, we can calculate the mean squares with our mean square formula. First, we'll take the sum of squares between and divide by the degrees of freedom between. And then we'll calculate the mean square within by taking the sum of squares within and dividing by the degrees of freedom within. We'll use these two numbers to calculate the F ratio by dividing the mean square between by the mean square within, and we come up with 10 divided by 2, which is 5. Well, that's it for today. I hope this helps you study for exam 4. I would also go back and review your end of chapter exams for chapter 12 and 14, and I'll see you next time. Take care.